What's poppin', my Ricks and Mortys? It's me, MT, and welcome back to the Heavy Spoiler Show, y'all. This is going to be a breakdown for the third episode of Rick and Morty Season 8, titled The Rick, the Mort, and the Ugly. So, there is definitely going to be some heavy spoilers ahead. You have been warned. So, let's go ahead and jump into it, my nerd babies. The title, The Rick, the Mort, and the Ugly, is of course a reference to the 1966 spaghetti western, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, starring Clint Eastwood, an absolute classic of a cowboy tale that this episode's own western theme takes inspiration from. And during the intro credit sequence, we see a literal thumb wrestling match being held between Beth and Morty and Rick and Space Beth, while an audience of feet with faces watching the audience, followed by what appears to be Rick, Morty, Jerry, and Summer as goats eating the body of a trash can, while miniature versions of Jerry watch them in the background. Not sure why we have two Jerrys here in this scenario, but maybe this could mean that we have another Jerry Barry themed episode in our feature this season. Who knows? This is then followed by a quick moment of a pointy-eared Morty beating up a pointy-eared Rick on what appears to be a high-tech futuristic cruise ship. Before we get a quick clip of Mr. Nimbus kissing Rick on the cheek. We can see that Rick has gills here and appears to be spending a good amount of time in Mr. Nimbus's undersea kingdom. But it's not exactly clear whether this is from a future episode or merely just a flashback sequence to when the two of them used to be close friends with subaquatic benefits before they became sworn enemies. Mr. Nimbus is of course a parody of Namor from Marvel Comics, as Rick is partly a parody of Namor's arch nemesis, Reed Richards, so their rivalry in this parody of a cartoon universe makes sense. This is then followed by a funny little tribute to the classic video game Tetris, where each member of the Smith family is presented as various Tetris blocks, matching the colors of their shirts. Summer in pink off to the side, Rick in blue, Morty in yellow, Beth in red, and a nervous Jerry about to completely wreck everything in green. The only Tetris piece that doesn't match a t-shirt color theme is Space Beth's orange piece. But I do find it kind of funny that Beth is sitting on Space Beth's face here, because we all know that this isn't the first time that that has happened, as evidenced by their previous relationship in Season 6, Episode 3's Bethic Twin Stink episode. Also, the family is on level 8 of Tetris here, which is likely a nod to how this is the 8th season of the show. Then the episode begins with Rick and Morty flying through the wreckage of the Citadel of Ricks, with the lifeless body of the Citadel mascot Andy, who died like he lived, in a stupid-ass red ampersand costume floating in the foreground, with Andy making his first appearance in Season 5, Episode 10's Rick Mirai Jack. This is of course the same episode where we see the destruction of the Citadel itself by the hands of Evil Morty, after learning that the Citadel of Ricks had a massive Morty cloning farm underneath the city, a plot thread that is continued in this episode. But in regards to our good, non-evil Morty, he's just chilling inside of Rick's spaceship playing with a fidget spinner, the hottest toy of 2017 for those with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, like me. Rick makes fun of him for using one so late in the game, but Morty merely says he's simply being retro. And while collecting some wreckage, some of that wreckage ends up cracking Rick's windshield, forcing the two to land on a nearby asteroid inhabited by survivors of the Citadel's destruction. And as the two fly by the Morty part of town, we can see that these cloned Mortys have built themselves an arcade in the style of a saloon from the Old West in the background. And in the foreground, we can see a Morty clone reading a copy of Sex Vogue magazine, an adult parody of Vogue magazine in real life. And next to that Morty is a Morty wearing the skeleton of a bull while playing with a yo-yo, one of the most popular toys when I was a kid in the 1990s, and essentially the fidget spinners of their time, which shows that every Morty has some type of affinity towards retro trends. The two then decide to land in the middle of a field of crystal corn, and it's possible that these blue crystals could be a form of death crystals, like the kind that we saw as the main focus of Season 4, Episode 1, which saw Morty obsessively using one of these crystals to see different scenarios of how he could die. But that isn't 100% clear here. However, it would turn out that Rick and Morty have landed on the property of another Rick, who survived the destruction of the Citadel. This Rick in overalls threatens Rick and Morty with a gun, telling them to get off of his property, which the two do after Rick quickly repairs his car. Then the story continues in the perspective of this crystal corn farmer Rick, who continues his day working on his weird farm of mutated creatures. our first indications of this Rick's past as the Citadel's chief cloning scientist. Then the song The Luckiest Man by the Wood Brothers plays in the background as we watch Rick feed these crystals into a machine that turns them into some type of liquid, before packing a bunch of containers of this liquid into his truck and heading into the Morty part of town. As Rick drives down the road, the remains of the main body of the Citadel can be seen blocking the sunset on the horizon. I know, extremely hard to miss, but I thought I'd point that out. Then this Rick heads into the arcade saloon that was seen earlier, and as he enters, we can see one of the Mortys in the establishment frowning while playing an arcade game, immediately showing us how much of a gambling addiction this gambling Morty has, which is why we end up seeing him choose to live on a casino planet by the end of the episode. Bro sucks at gambling, but he just doesn't know when to quit. But while Overalls Rick orders some supplies at the front of the bar, a spaceship of Rick clones lands in the middle of town while playing a car horn version of the La Cucaracha song before a bunch of Ricks start kidnapping all the Morty clones that they can find, very much acting like a gang of evil outlaws in an old Western movie. Then, after shooting the shit out of this Overalls Rick, the Rick clones then bring the Morty clones to their new Citadel, where all the Rick clone survivors have gathered to work on rebuilding their former society under the rule of Big Rick himself, who has the cadence and style of a Kentucky Colonel, with him obviously being a parody of Kentucky Fried Chicken mascot Colonel Sanders. And after the Rick clones drop off their haul of Mortys, one of the Rick smugglers is escorted to Big Rick by a Rick clone modeled after the character Oddjob from the James Bond movie Goldfinger from 1964. And as the two approach Big Rick at his establishment, we can see 3 female Ricks entertaining a room filled of Southern-style Ricks, with one of those female Ricks performing on stage, one of them entertaining a table of Ricks in a red dress, and another Rick far in the background having a romantic night with one of the male Rick clones. And you know what? Good for them. I wish them a happy and long life together until they're immediately killed by Overalls Rick by the end of the episode. Big Rick then tells Outlaw Rick that he was originally cloned to be the mascot of a chain of gumbo restaurants on the Citadel before the Citadel was destroyed, and that he's planning on acquiring the right amount of Mortys necessary in order to have the workforce to rebuild the Citadel in his image, which is of course why all of those Mortys were being kidnapped and experimented on in the first place. But eventually Overalls Rick comes to after being repaired by some flying medical drones, only to find that the gang of Rick clones decided to take a trip to his house to completely wreck everything, steal his cloning equipment, and then judge his taste in music, specifically his love for American singer-songwriter Tori Amos, leaving the message, "What grown man listens to Tori Amos?" smeared in feces on the floor. And when Rick goes to check on the status of his beloved Tori Amos CD, we can see that the Ricks have completely defaced Tori's Little Earthquakes album from 1992, which, according to the new Pope, is now the most egregious sin of all, especially when you draw Tori Amos with a stinky anus. Straight to hell, straight to hell. And with Rick's beloved two-headed pig having been amongst those farm animals killed by the Rick outlaws, Overalls then opens up a hidden stash of guns in his floorboards to go avenge his pet, John Wick style. And using the remnants of a broken beer bottle left behind by one of the Rick clones, Overalls manages to track the location of the abandoned brewery about 3 parsecs away. That's about 57.6 trillion miles away from his current location, which is absolutely insane. Like, if you piss a Rick off, that old crusty motherfucker will find you like some type of sci-fi Liam Neeson. Overalls then manages to track the Ricks down to a planet that has an average temperature of 104 degrees Fahrenheit, with its highest temperatures reaching up to 132.8 degrees Fahrenheit, which is fantastic for pale people who desperately need a tan. But it's a good thing that the Ricks are rebuilding the Citadel for everybody else who desires a little bit of shade and likes the thought of not dying from a heat stroke. Rick's computer can even detect traces of yeast, water, grains, coriander, maltose, sucrose, and gelatin coming from this brewery so far away, and then uses it to lock on to that specific location on the planet. It's pretty crazy. However, Overalls quickly finds that 2 Morty clones have stowed away in the back of his truck, a Morty named Doc, as well as the arcade bartender Morty called Arcade Morty. And after reluctantly agreeing to take them along, Rick begins his bloody assault on the brewery, with help from Arcade Morty. And during his assault, Rick whips out some energy bolas, just like the kind that Star-Lord has in his arsenal when he needs to restrain people, just like he did to Gamora when she tried to steal the orb from him in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 1. But Overalls decides to use his energy bolas to decapitate a Rick clone's neck. But while Overalls and Arcade Morty do manage to fight their way through the initial horde, Doc is unfortunately shot and killed. But at least he bled out before his body is burned to a crisp, which is always nice. You gotta look for those silver linings while you are slowly passing away. However, both Overalls and Arcade Morty are eventually captured by Big Rick and his goons while trying to free the other captured and cloned Mortys, leading to Arcade Morty discovering that Overalls isn't a cloned Rick at all, but the former Chief Morty replicator of the Citadel. Bum bum bum! Big Rick then forces Overalls to start cloning Mortys for him using the DNA of his victims, but Rick overdoes the process, creating a massively genetically deformed Morty abomination who starts murdering all of Big Rick's goons. And taking advantage of the chaos, Rick leads all the Mortys to a spare ship where he decides to sacrifice himself so that the Mortys can have a chance at living normal lives out there in the universe. And this is before the song Little Earthquakes by Rick's favorite artist, Tori Amos, plays in the background as Overall slowly makes his way to Big Rick, blasting through countless Rick clones along the way with his vast sci-fi armory and hovering battle drones. Big Rick then heads to his office where we can see a big framed picture of Big Rick's gumbo hutch behind his desk, which was used by Big Rick to hide a stash of portal fluid in a safe. Then after Big Rick kills Outlaw Rick with the help of his desk gun, after Outlaw Rick tries to get one up on him, he eventually comes face to face with Overalls, who has killed a shit ton of his workforce, including poor old Oddjob Rick. After Big Rick confuses Overalls for his father, Overalls declines that role by telling Big Rick that he merely consulted with the Citadel on Big Rick's creation, before blowing his not son into oblivion along with the rest of his Citadel. I do wonder if this Rick took inspiration from the Godfather parody Big Fat Rick, introduced in Season 5, Episode 7, during that episode's tribute to mafia films like The Godfather. I feel like he looks a lot like Big Fat Rick here. But after watching the destruction of Big Rick's Citadel like Thor and the people of Asgard watched Asgard's destruction in Thor Ragnarok, Arcade Morty takes the other cloned Mortys to different planets where they can all start new lives. One Morty with a straw in his mouth and a bindle on his back is sent to a lush planet full of vegetation, much like Thanos' planet of Sanctuary that we saw at the end of Avengers Infinity War and at the beginning of Avengers Endgame. The Morty with a bull skeleton on his face is sent to an alien cow planet, where he's immediately accepted by said alien cows, along with these other chubby little one-eyed purple alien creatures. The Morty with a gambling addiction gets sent to a casino, while Mining Morty gets sent to a random asteroid mining facility where he can mine his life away without any surefire way of ever getting off of that asteroid ever again. Like, that boy is trapped there. I don't know what you were thinking. And finally, Arcade Morty heads back to the destroyed farm of Overalls Rick, where he puts up 2 crosses in memory of both Rick and Doc. And on Rick's grave, he writes his birth and death year with 2 X's at the end of each, much like is commonly seen in the Mega Man video game franchise, in order to not specify exactly what year in the 2000s the story takes place. Then, out of nowhere, the main Rick and Morty appear back on the planet in order to find Morty's fidget spinner, leading to Rick giving his grandson credit for being right about leaving it behind on the planet, displaying real growth of character throughout these past 8 seasons, as he is now able to have a more respectful relationship with his grandson. And then, of course, after the credits, we get a funny little post-credit scene of the 2 fighting dice that we saw the Rick clones playing with earlier, rising from the wreckage to continue their never-ending brawl, endlessly fighting like a pair of Rock'em Sock'em robots in Toy Story 2.
He was talking to me! No, he was talking to me! Why, you...
But yeah, all in all, I thought this episode of Rick and Morty was okay. I mean, it was definitely cool to see what happened to all the clones after the destruction of the Citadel, but as a whole, I think I would have much preferred to have an episode centered around the main Rick and Morty family, rather than following a bunch of Rick and Morty clones the entire time. I mean, not every Rick and Morty episode necessarily has to move the overall plot forward in some big meaningful way, but I didn't necessarily care about any of the characters introduced in this episode. But at the end of the day, what really makes a good episode of Rick and Morty worth watching is if that episode is funny and outrageous, and this episode very much has those 2 things. However, I do feel like Rick and Morty is at its funniest when there are other voices outside of Rick and Morty's present in the episode. I mean, Ian Cardoni and Harry Belden are great as Rick and Morty respectively, but only hearing those two voices throughout the entire episode can become a little bit much after a while. This is partly why I was such a big fan of Colonel Sanders' parody Big Rick throughout the episode, as his accent was a much needed reprieve from all the Rick and Morty clone voices. And I also really enjoyed the way this episode ended with Overall's Rick sacrificing himself to free the Mortys and destroy the remains of the Citadel, because even though this Rick claimed that he was merely on a quest of vengeance for himself, it is quite clear that this Rick still has a heart for his grandson and wanted to undo the mistake that was his Morty cloning technology. It was a great display of Rick's selfless side and how, despite his annoyance with Morty, he is still willing to die for his favorite right-hand man. But yeah, personally, this is not my favorite episode of the season so far, but it is still a fun one that very much highlights the heart of gold underneath every Rick's tough exterior. But yeah, that is it for this breakdown of episode 3 of season 8 of Rick and Morty. What do you guys think of the episode? Let us know in the comment section down below. You guys can follow me at MasterTainment on Twitter, Blue Sky, Instagram, wherever I am on the internet, but most importantly, follow Heavy Spoilers here on YouTube by hitting the subscribe button and maybe even hitting that like button if you guys enjoyed the video. But like always, I've been MT, you guys have been amazing, and I'll catch you guys later. Bye.